Vladimir Putin has spent more than 2 decades solving the fundamental problem facing authoritarian leaders. How do you stay in power? He has sidelined potential rivals, weakened alternative centers of political power, and surrounded himself with people he trusts. And perhaps most important, he has never allowed anyone else to become powerful enough to look like his obvious successor. That has worked. Putin is still in the Kremlin. He has dominated Russian politics for more than 2 decades. But there is a problem he cannot solve indefinitely. One day Putin will go. And when that happens, Russia may discover that the system Putin built to make himself almost impossible to challenge has also made it remarkably difficult to replace him. And that raises a much bigger question than simply who becomes the next Russian president. The real question is, who controls Russia when Putin is gone? Because Russia is just not another country. It has one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals. It's a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It remains one of the world's most important energy producers and is already at the center of the biggest military confrontation in Europe in generations. So a Russian succession crisis wouldn't simply be a Kremlin story. It could become a global geopolitical crisis. And the strange thing is that Putin may have created the conditions for exactly that possibility. Let's start with the first part, the man at the top. To understand the succession problem, you first have to understand what Putin built. Russia still has a constitution. It has elections, a parliament, political parties, also a prime minister. And technically, it even has a succession procedure. If the Russian presidency becomes vacant, the prime minister temporarily assumes presidential duties, and a new presidential election is supposed to take place within 3 months. So on paper, everything looks straightforward. But politics isn't just about what is written in a constitution. It is about who controls the institutions behind it. And over the last 2 decades, Putin has built a political system in which real power is concentrated around him. The security services matters, the military matters, the presidential administration matters, Russia's economic elite matter, but none of these institutions have been allowed to become an independent political center capable of challenging the Kremlin. And this is where Putin's greatest political achievement creates his greatest future problem. He has made himself the center of the system, but he has not created an equally powerful mechanism for replacing the center. So let's move on to whether Putin has already tested succession. And we've actually seen a version of this before. In 2008, Putin could not constitutionally serve another 6 consecutive presidential term. So Dmitry Medvedev became the president. Putin became the prime minister. For 4 years, Russia had 2 men occupying the 2 most powerful political positions of the country. And it looked for a while like Russia might have developed a mechanism for transferring power. But there was one problem. There was never really any doubt about who remained the dominant political figure. Putin returned to the presidency in 2012. Medvedev never developed an independent political power base capable of competing with him. And the message to the Russian political elite was clear. There was one apex of the system, and that was Putin. That matters because a successful succession isn't simply about having somebody who can legally become president. It is about having somebody who can command the loyalty of the institutions that actually make the state function. And that is much harder. So, who actually replaces Putin? Take Mikhail Mishustin. He's the current Russian Prime Minister. And constitutionally, that makes him extremely important. If Putin suddenly becomes unable to perform his presidential duties, Mishustin would temporarily assume those responsibilities. But becoming acting president is not the same thing as becoming the uncontested leader of Russia. Imagine if Putin suddenly disappears from the political system for whatever reason. The Prime Minister becomes acting president. What happens next? What does the military do? What does the presidential administration do? What do regional governors do? What do Russia's most powerful economic networks do? And critically, do they all agree? This is the real succession question. The Constitution can establish the procedure. It cannot guarantee political obedience. And one thing for sure is that Russia has a gerontocracy problem. This brings us to something that I think is much less discussed. Russia doesn't simply have a Putin succession problem. It has an aging elite problem. Look at the people who have occupied some of the most powerful positions in the Russian state for years. The FSB chief, Alexander Bortnikov, is in his mid-70s. The Foreign Intelligence Services chief, Sergei Narishkin, is in his early 70s. Other senior figures around Putin are from essentially the same political generation. These are not people who appeared in the Kremlin yesterday. Many have spent decades building their careers alongside Putin. And from Putin's perspective, there is an obvious reason to keep them. He knows them, he trusts them, he knows how they think, and they have demonstrated their loyalty. But there is a hidden cost. If the same people remain at the top for decades, the generation beneath them never gets the opportunity to acquire equivalent power, and that creates a strange political bottleneck. So, what is this generation that has been waiting? Imagine that you are a Russian official in your 50s. You have spent the last 30 years working your way through the system. You have built relationships. You've accumulated experience. You have ambitions. You're hardworking. You're smart. Normally, you would expect the generation above you to gradually retire. But what happens if they don't? You remain a deputy or a governor or a second-tier official. You have responsibility, but you don't necessarily have the institutional power that comes with being at the very top. And then something even more interesting happens. You see younger people, sometimes with powerful family or political connections, move rapidly into important positions. Recent analysis of Russia's elite has highlighted exactly this phenomenon. Younger figures connected to the Putin-era networks are increasingly appearing in senior government and state positions. So Russia potentially has 3 generations competing for the future. An aging generation that currently controls the system, a middle generation that has spent years waiting for promotion, and a younger generation that may be gaining access through family networks. This isn't simply a demographic issue. It could become a political fault line, because when Putin is gone, these people won't necessarily have identical interests. They may want different things, different positions, different economic assets, different relationships with the West, different approaches to the war in Ukraine, and different ideas about who should control the state. And let's go to a different part, that Russia has actually seen this before. There is an uncomfortable historic parallel. Joseph Stalin died in 1953, and when he died, there was no obvious successor capable of immediately dominating the Soviet system. Georgy Malenkov initially appeared to be in the strongest position, but other powerful figures controlled other parts of the state. Lavrentiy Beria controlled the security apparatus. Nikita Khrushchev controlled important parts of the Communist Party. Vyacheslav Molotov remained influential. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had enormous military prestige. And what happened? There was no orderly handover, a struggle among insiders. Beria was arrested and executed. Khrushchev gradually defeated his rivals, and eventually he became the dominant leader. Now, to be absolutely clear, Putin's Russia is not Stalin's Soviet Union. The political system is completely different, but the historical lesson is important. When an extremely powerful leader disappears, the people who spent years operating underneath him can suddenly discover that they have power bases of their own. Institutions that appeared obedient can become competing centers of power, and relationships that appeared stable can change very quickly. So, what happens? There are 4 ways this could play out. So let's say Putin eventually leaves. There are at least 4 broad possibilities, and none of them necessarily leads to a democracy. Scenario 1 is a managed succession. The most optimistic scenario is that Russia's elite reach an agreement. The security services, the military, presidential administration, and economic establishment agree on a compromise candidate, someone acceptable to everyone. That person becomes the president. The system continues. There may be some policy changes, negotiations with Ukraine, relationships with the West, but the basic political structure survives. This is probably what most of Russia's elite would prefer, because they have something that they can lose from the chaos. Scenario 2 is a collective leadership. This second possibility is more interesting. Nobody is strong enough to dominate the others, so several factions govern together. The president becomes more of a consensus figure. The security services retain influence, the military retains influence, so does the economic establishment. For a while, this could work, but collective leadership creates its own problem. Eventually, somebody may decide, why should I remain number 2? And that is when the internal competition could intensify. Scenario 3 is that the security establishment wins. This is the third possibility, in that Russia's security institutions become decisive. A successor emerges who represents the Siloviki, the security and military establishment. The argument would be straightforward. Russia is under external threat. The country needs stability. The state needs a strong hand, and the security establishment is the institution capable of providing it. That could produce a successor who is more nationalist and more confrontational with the West rather than less. This is an important point. We should not automatically assume that post-Putin equals liberalization. It might, but it might not. Scenario 4 is where the elite struggle. This is a scenario everyone should worry about. No faction can dominate. The security services want one thing, the military wants another, economic interests want another, regional elites begin repositioning themselves, and foreign policy becomes part of the internal struggle. A politician might take a harder position towards the West because nationalism makes them look stronger at home. Another might advocate negotiations because economic stability is more important to their faction. The result isn't necessarily civil war. It could simply be prolonged political uncertainty. But in a country with nuclear weapons and one of the world's largest militaries, even uncertainty can be dangerous. So, what is the biggest mistake that the West could make in this situation? And this is where I think Western governments could make a serious analytical mistake. They may focus on one question: who is the next Putin? Will it be Mishustin, a security figure, a younger politician, somebody nobody's talking about today? But that may be the wrong framework. The more important question is, who controls the Russian state during the transition? Because Russia could theoretically have a president who's relatively moderate but lacks control of the security services, or a president who wants negotiations but needs to satisfy nationalist forces inside the military, or a collective leadership in which different factions pursue different policies. That creates an entirely different risk environment, and it also matters economically. Russia remains one of the world's largest energy producers. Any uncertainty of a Russian leadership could affect the price of oil, gas, LNG, shipping, sanctions, China-Russia relationships, and global commodity prices. So the succession question isn't just for Russia specialists. It matters to anyone who cares about energy, markets, or geopolitics. So this is a risk nobody can time. Nobody knows when the transition will happen. Putin could remain in power for years. There is no reason to assume that his departure is imminent. This isn't about predicting a date, it's about recognizing a structural vulnerability. Russia's political elite is aging. The generation below it is waiting. Younger networks with family ties are developing. And the longer the system remains centered around one individual, the more difficult it may become to know what happens when that individual disappears. For 25 years, Putin has been extraordinarily successful at solving one problem. Nobody can replace him while he is there. But that success may create another problem. What happens when he's not there? So, how do we draw all this? What is the main conclusion? The biggest mistake would be to assume that the post-Putin question is simply who becomes Russia's next president. It may be something much more complicated. For me, I think the ultimate question is which group of Russians gets to decide who is in charge? Security services, the military, the economic networks, the oligarchs. Putin has spent more than 2 decades building a political system around personal loyalty, trusted networks, and the suppression of alternative centers of power. That system has proved extraordinarily durable, but has never truly demonstrated that it can function without the person at its center. Eventually it would have to. And when that day comes, Russia's biggest geopolitical risk may not be that Putin is replaced by someone more extreme, or maybe more moderate. It may be that nobody immediately has enough power to replace him, because Putin may have solved the problem of how to remain in power. What he's not solved is how Russia transfers power when he's gone. And for a nuclear-armed state at the center of Europe's security architecture and global energy markets, that may ultimately prove to be the more consequential question. If you found this analysis useful, subscribe, because in the next video we'll look at another question that could reshape global energy markets. What happens to Russian oil and gas if the political system that controls